The alarm on Sergeant Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had for the last 8 years. She reached over and silenced it before it could wake her roommate, then lay in the darkness for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Fort Bliss starting to wake up outside her barracks window. The desert air was already warm, even before sunrise. In another hour, the Arizona heat would be relentless. Sarah was 32 years old, with dark blonde hair she kept in a tight bun, sharp blue eyes, and a mouth that had learned not to smile much anymore. She'd been in the Army for a decade, and in that time she'd become exactly what she'd set out to become, a weapons-loading specialist for Apache helicopters, one of the most dangerous jobs on the base. She was good at it, better than good. She was exceptional. But nobody treated her like she was exceptional. Sarah pulled on her Army combat uniform, laced her boots with practiced efficiency, and grabbed her ID badge. As she walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the flight line, she passed a group of junior soldiers jogging in formation. One of them, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, did a double-take when he saw her. "Hey, Sarge," he called out, his voice dripping with fake respect. "You heading to the office to file paperwork? That's more your speed, right?" His friends laughed. Sarah didn't break stride. This was routine. This was her life at Fort Bliss. The joke, as it always was that women didn't belong loading weapons onto attack helicopters. The Army had officially integrated these positions years ago, but integration and acceptance were two different things. Sarah had watched male soldiers with half her experience get promoted faster. She'd watched them get better assignments. She'd watched them get respect. What she'd gotten was 2 Purple Hearts, a commendation for valor under fire, and a nickname that followed her everywhere: Mama Bear. Not because she was nurturing or protective of the younger soldiers. The nickname had come from a single incident 5 years ago when a 22-year-old pilot had made a crude joke about her in the break room. She'd broken his nose with a single punch. Now everyone called her Mama Bear, and everyone stayed out of her way, but not out of respect, out of fear. The flight line at dawn was Sarah's kingdom. The massive hangars echoed with the sounds of preparation. Men in flight suits checked systems. Maintenance crews performed pre-flight inspections. And there, in her designated area, sat the Apache, mechanical predators waiting to be armed. Sarah moved to her station with a soft sigh. Her supervisor, Sergeant First Class Dennis Warner, was already there, drinking bad coffee from a travel mug. He was a decent man, one of the few who'd never treated her like she was taking a man's job. Still, even he sometimes forgot to call on her opinion or ask for her input on complex loading procedures. "Morning, Mitchell," he said without looking up from his tablet. "Got an early tasking today. Captain Reeves is taking out one of the airframes at 0700 hours, Apache 757, full combat load." Sarah nodded. Full combat load meant Hydra 70 rockets, Hellfire missiles, and rounds for the 325-pound chain gun. It meant precision work. It meant everything had to be perfect or people died. "I've got it," she said simply. Dennis finally looked at her. He was a big man with graying hair and a weathered face that had seen 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. "I know you do," he said. "You're the best I've got." It was a small thing, just a sentence, but Sarah felt something in her chest crack open just a little bit. The best. For once, someone had said it out loud. She spent the next 3 hours loading Apache 757 with meticulous care. Every missile locked into its launcher with a satisfying click. Every rocket aligned perfectly. Every ammunition belt fed into the gun system in neat, organized rows. She worked with her headphones on, communicating with the maintenance team through her radio when necessary, but mostly staying in her own zone of concentration. By 6:30, the Apache was ready. Sarah did a final walk around, checking every connection, every safety mechanism, every detail that could mean life or death for the pilots and the people on the ground below. It was perfect. At 6:45, Captain James Reeves walked out to his aircraft. He was young, maybe 35, with sandy hair and the kind of confident walk that came from knowing you were one of the best pilots on the base. Sarah had loaded weapons for him a dozen times. He'd never said thank you. He rarely said anything to her at all. He did his own pre-flight inspection, checking the systems that Sarah had prepared. She watched from a distance, as she always did, making sure everything was to his satisfaction. This was part of her job that most people didn't understand. Loading weapons was only half of it. The other half was making sure the pilot trusted that the job had been done right. Reeves looked over the loaded systems and gave a small nod. Then he looked around, spotted Sarah, and for just a moment their eyes met. She saw something in his face change. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, looking at her intently, searching for something. Then he looked away and climbed into the Apache without a word. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of that strange look. It had been different from the usual indifference or mild contempt. There had been something in it, something that had looked almost like recognition or fear. She pushed the thought aside and headed back to the hangar. There was always another helicopter waiting to be loaded. There was always another mission. There was always the same quiet, unspoken assumption that she didn't belong here, no matter how perfectly she did her job. What Sarah didn't know was that Captain Reeves had seen something in that moment that would change everything. He'd seen something that shouldn't have been possible, something that had been dead for 5 years, something that existed only in classified files and classified memories. As Apache 757 lifted off into the Arizona morning and headed toward the horizon, the seed of a terrible secret had already been planted. And within 48 hours, it would begin to grow. Sarah Mitchell had no idea that her orderly, controlled life was about to become anything but controlled. She had no idea that her past, a past she thought was buried forever, was about to come crashing back into the present. And she had no idea that the tattoo on her left shoulder blade, a tattoo she covered with her uniform every single day, was about to cost her everything. The next morning, Sarah was finishing her pre-flight checks on Apache 683 when she noticed something off. The hangar felt different, quieter. The usual chatter and movement seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on the entire base. She didn't understand why until Sergeant First Class Dennis Warner appeared at her elbow, his face pale and his jaw tight. "Sarah," he said quietly, "we need to step into my office, right now." Her heart didn't skip. Sarah had learned a long time ago not to let her heart skip, but something cold moved through her chest, something that felt like dread. The office was small, just a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet in a corner of the hangar. Dennis closed the door behind them, which was unusual. He always left it open. Transparency, that was his way. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Dennis's voice was low, careful. "Have you had any contact with Captain Reeves outside of work? Any conversations? Anything unusual?" "No," Sarah said flatly. "Why?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. His hands were clenched into fists on his desk. "He called this morning. He said he wants you removed from Apache rotation. He specifically requested that you not load any aircraft that he pilots." Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical blow. "Why?" "He wouldn't say. He just said it was a security matter and that he was going through official channels." Dennis's blue eyes bored into hers. "Now, I've worked with you for 6 years. I know you're a good soldier and a professional, but I also know there's something about you that makes people uncomfortable. I know about the incident with that pilot. I know you keep to yourself. And I know that whatever happened between you and Reeves has spooked him enough to go above my head." "There's nothing between me and Captain Reeves," Sarah said quietly. "I've loaded his helicopters a dozen times, that's it." "Then why does he suddenly think you're a security risk?" Sarah wanted to answer him. She wanted to tell him the truth. But the truth was complicated, and more importantly, the truth was classified. The truth was locked away in a file that she'd been told, in no uncertain terms, would follow her for the rest of her military career. "I don't know," she said instead. And that wasn't a lie. She honestly didn't know how he'd found out. She'd been so careful. Dennis stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking very tired. "Colonel Hartman is going to want to talk to you, probably today. When he does, I want you to know that I'm on your side. You're the best armorer I've got, and I don't care what ghost from your past is walking around. You deserve the benefit of the doubt." "Thank you," Sarah said. But she wasn't thinking about Dennis. She was thinking about Captain James Reeves and the way he'd looked at her when he'd seen her the morning before. Like he'd seen a ghost. Like he'd seen something that shouldn't exist. The conversation with Colonel Hartman happened at 1400 hours in his office on the 2nd floor of the command building. Hartman was 58, with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years in the military. He didn't smile much, and he certainly wasn't smiling now. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk, "please sit." She sat. "I'm going to be direct with you. Captain Reeves has requested that you be reassigned. He says it's a security matter. Now, before I can proceed with that request, I need to understand what his concern is. So I need you to tell me about your relationship with Captain Reeves. We don't have a relationship, Sarah said. I load his helicopters, that's the extent of our interaction. And you've never discussed anything classified with him? No. You've never given him any reason to believe you're a security risk? No. Hartman leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. I'm going to be frank with you, Sergeant. You have a file. A sealed file. I'm aware of its existence, but I can't access it without specific authorization. Normally, that wouldn't matter, but Reeves seems to think that whatever is in that file is relevant to his request. Sarah's mouth felt dry. What do you want me to do? I want you to tell me what's in that file. I want you to explain to me why a decorated pilot is suddenly so concerned about your presence on this base that he's going through the chain of command to get you reassigned. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about the tattoo on her shoulder blade. She thought about the girl she'd been 7 years ago. She thought about the promises she'd made to herself and to the people in charge, the promises that had made all of this possible. I can't, she said quietly. That file is classified above your pay grade, you know that. For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered across Hartman's face. I do know that, he said, which means this is worse than I thought. He leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. You'll remain on the base, but you won't have access to the flight line or any classified systems. You'll report to me every morning at 0800 hours. We're going to get to the bottom of this. Sarah nodded. She'd expected as much. As she stood to leave, Hartman said her name. She turned back. For what it's worth, he said, you've got a good record. Whatever this is, I hope you can clear it up. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that there was a way through this. But as she walked out of his office and back to her barracks, the only thing she could feel was the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to suffocate her. That night, alone in her room, Sarah pulled off her Army PT shirt and looked at the tattoo on her left shoulder blade in the mirror. It was small, just 2 inches tall, a design of intersecting lines that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know the truth. To everyone else, it was just another military tattoo, just decoration. But to Captain James Reeves, apparently it was a red flag, a sign of something dangerous, a marker of a life that should have ended 7 years ago. For 3 days, Sarah reported to Colonel Hartman's office every morning. For 3 days, nothing happened. She wasn't questioned. She wasn't interrogated. Hartman simply wanted to see her, wanted to confirm that she was still on the base, and then dismissed her without a word. It was a strange kind of purgatory, waiting for something she couldn't predict or control. On the 4th day, everything changed. She was in her barracks, lying on her bunk and staring at the ceiling, when there was a knock on her door. It was hard and authoritative. Sarah got up and opened it to find a man in a suit, early 40s, with dark hair and an expression that suggested he'd seen things that normal people never saw. Sergeant Sarah Mitchell? He asked, even though he clearly already knew the answer. Yes. I'm Special Agent Thomas Blackwell, Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. I need to ask you some questions. We can do this here or we can do this in my office on the base. Your choice. Sarah stepped back and let him in. He was professional, efficient, and utterly terrifying. This was the worst possible scenario. This meant that Reeves hadn't just flagged her to Hartman. This meant he'd gone higher, much higher. Blackwell sat on her desk chair without being invited. Sarah sat on her bunk. Let's talk about your history, he said, pulling out a small notebook. Before the Army, you worked for the State Department, contractor position. Istanbul 2016 to 2018. Tell me about that. Sarah's heart was beating fast now, but she kept her voice steady. I can't. That work is classified. I know it is, Blackwell said. I have the clearance to hear it, and you have the obligation to tell me. He was right, of course. If he had the clearance, she had to cooperate. She took a breath and began to talk. I was part of a liaison program, she said carefully. We worked with Turkish intelligence agencies on counterterrorism operations. My job was to provide tactical support and assessment. And you did good work. I did my job. You did exceptional work, Blackwell corrected. So exceptional that you got noticed by the wrong people, specifically by a terrorist organization called Karakol. They learned your identity. They learned where you lived. They learned your patterns and your routines. Do you remember what happened next? Sarah closed her eyes. She remembered. God, did she remember? There was an attempt, she said quietly, on my life. Not just an attempt, Blackwell said. A planned kidnapping. The Turkish authorities stopped it. 3 men were arrested. They were part of a sleeper cell, but the cell wasn't based in Istanbul. It was based here in the United States. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. This was the part that never made sense. This was the part that had terrified her when she'd first learned about it. The decision was made, Blackwell continued, that you would be extracted from Turkey and relocated. New name, new identity, new life, except you didn't want a new life. You wanted a military life. You wanted to serve your country, so a deal was made. You would enlist in the army under your real name, but a sealed file would be created documenting the threat. If anything ever happened, if Karakol ever reactivated, the army would be notified immediately. You were placed under the assumption that you'd never be recognized, that the cell had been broken, that the threat had passed. And I haven't been recognized, Sarah said. Not until now. Not until Captain Reeves, Blackwell said. Now here's the interesting part. Reeves wasn't part of the original investigation. He came to the army 3 years after you enlisted, but he was part of the follow-up investigation. He worked with us to track the remaining members of the cell. He saw the file. He saw your photograph. He saw the tattoo that's marked as a potential identifying marker. Sarah said nothing. So the question is, Blackwell said, leaning forward, why did Captain Reeves wait 3 years to report what he saw? Why didn't he come forward when he first encountered you? And more importantly, why did he wait until you were in a position to load weapons onto his helicopter before he said anything? The implications of that question hung in the air between them like poison gas. You think he's part of the cell? Sarah said. I think it's possible, Blackwell said. I think Captain James Reeves might not be Captain James Reeves at all. I think he might be someone who infiltrated the military specifically to get close to you. And I think that if we hadn't been paying attention, we might have missed it entirely. You could have loaded weapons onto that helicopter. He could have flown to a remote location, and something very bad could have happened. Sarah felt the room spin. All of those looks, all of those strange moments, they suddenly made sense. She'd thought Reeves was just indifferent to her. She'd thought he'd simply been an unremarkable pilot with no particular interest in her existence. But he'd been watching her. He'd been studying her. He'd been waiting for the right moment. What happens now? She asked. Now, Blackwell said, standing up, we make sure that whatever James Reeves's plan was, it stops. We remove him from the flight line. We investigate his background thoroughly, and we protect you, Sergeant Mitchell, because if I'm right, you're in more danger than you've been in 7 years. Captain James Reeves was arrested at his on-base residence at 0600 hours the following morning. Sarah watched from the barracks window as military police placed him in handcuffs and led him away. He didn't struggle. He didn't protest. He simply looked resigned, like someone who'd been caught in a game and had accepted the consequences. The investigation that followed was the most intense period of Sarah's military career. For 2 weeks, she was interviewed repeatedly by agents from DCSA, the FBI, and the Army's Criminal Investigation Command. She recounted every interaction she'd had with Reeves, every conversation, every look, every moment when something had felt off. And slowly, the truth emerged. Captain James Reeves was not his real name. His real name was Nuri Demirsay, a Turkish national whose father had been a commander in the Karakol organization. When the Turkish and American authorities had broken the cell in Istanbul in 2016, Nuri had been in Europe, operating under an assumed identity. He'd spent 2 years building a legend, 2 years creating a background that would be deep enough, authentic enough, to fool background investigators. Then he'd entered the United States on fraudulent documents and begun the slow, methodical process of infiltrating the military. It had taken him 3 years to get assigned to Fort Bliss, 3 more years to work his way up to being a pilot, and only then, when he'd seen Sarah loading weapons onto a helicopter, had everything aligned. The moment was coming. The plan was ready. The plan, according to the intelligence analysts, was to use the helicopter and the weapons Sarah had loaded to commit an act of terrorism, specifically, a strike against a diplomatic facility in the region, one that would create international chaos and give Karakol the platform it desperately needed. Sarah would be blamed as the weapons loader. The Muslim woman with terrorist connections would be the patsy, and Nuri would disappear into the wind. The evidence was overwhelming. The documents were airtight. Nuri's entire identity was a fabrication, constructed with frightening precision and patience. But it hadn't worked, because Captain Reeves had recognized Sarah from a classified file and he'd panicked. He'd blown the whistle, and in doing so, he'd inadvertently saved not just her life, but countless others. When Special Agent Blackwell told her all of this, Sarah sat in silence for a long time. "He did the right thing," she finally said. "Whatever his plan was, whatever he was going to do, he did the right thing when it mattered." "He did," Blackwell agreed. "Which is why this stays in the classified realm. There will be no public trial. Nuri Demiasai will disappear into the federal prison system, listed under a different name in a facility we don't advertise. His identity will remain sealed, and your identity remains protected." "And that's it?" Sarah asked. "Everyone goes back to normal." "Not everyone," Blackwell said. "You have a choice to make." He explained the options. She could transfer to a different base. She could resign from the Army with full benefits and no questions asked, or she could stay at Fort Bliss. If she stayed, it would be known, only to the highest levels of command, what had happened. She would be officially cleared of any wrongdoing, she would be reinstated to her position, and she would be protected. But people would still know something had happened. There would still be whispers, there would still be questions. "I want to stay," Sarah said immediately. "You're sure?" "I've earned my place on that flight line," she said. "I'm not leaving because a terrorist tried to kill me. I'm not leaving because I'm afraid. This is where I belong, and I'm going to prove it." 3 weeks later, Sarah returned to the flight line. The news had been carefully managed. The official story was that Captain Reeves had been reassigned due to a family emergency. Sarah had been cleared of all administrative suspicion and was returning to full duty. What wasn't said, but what everyone on the base somehow understood, was that something significant had happened. Something that involved high-level security agencies and classified investigations. Sarah could feel the shift the moment she walked back into the hangar. The junior enlisted soldiers who'd mocked her before, they straightened their posture when she passed. The crew chiefs who'd given her bare minimum respect now made sure to acknowledge her presence. The pilots who'd ignored her now made eye contact. It was a strange kind of respect, not the kind earned through decades of consistent excellence, though she had that too. This was the kind earned through mystery, through surviving something that others could sense but not quite understand. Sergeant First Class Dennis Warner was waiting for her at her station. He looked relieved to see her, genuinely relieved in a way that suggested he'd been worried about her. "Welcome back," he said. "We missed you." "It's good to be back," Sarah said. "You know," Dennis said, leaning against her work table, "I don't know what happened. I'm not asking. But whatever it was, whatever you went through, I want you to know that everyone on this flight line respects what you did. Whatever you did." "I just did my job," Sarah said. "No," Dennis said. "You did something more than that." Over the next month, Sarah fell back into her rhythm. She loaded helicopters. She maintained systems. She worked long hours in the Arizona heat, doing the same precise, careful work she'd always done. But something had changed, something fundamental. The weight of the secret was still there. It would always be there. But it was no longer a burden that pressed down on her in isolation. Now she carried it as part of something larger, part of a story that she would never be able to fully tell, but that had mattered. That had made a difference. 2 months after her return to duty, she received a formal letter from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. It was brief, official, and devastating in its simplicity. It commended her for her service. It acknowledged her sacrifice. And it awarded her a commendation for meritorious service, a medal that would go into her permanent file, even though the citation would remain sealed. She received the medal in a quiet ceremony in Colonel Hartman's office, with only Dennis and Hartman present. There was no fanfare, no public recognition, but that hadn't been what she'd needed. What she'd needed was to know that her sacrifice had been acknowledged by people who mattered, that she hadn't imagined the significance of what had happened, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. 3 months after her return, a new pilot arrived at Fort Bliss, a young woman maybe 28 years old with the call sign Viper. She was confident, competent, and friendly in a way that some of the other pilots weren't. On her first weapons loading mission, she made a point of watching Sarah work, asking questions, learning the process. At the end of the loading session, as Sarah was doing her final inspections, Viper approached her. "You know," Viper said, I've heard a lot about you. Nothing official, nothing that anyone will actually talk about directly. But I've heard that you're the kind of person who doesn't break under pressure. The kind of person who can handle anything and not blink. I'm just a weapons loader, Sarah said. You're a lot more than that, Viper said. And I want you to know that having you on this flight line makes me feel safer. Whatever you went through, whatever you survived, it means something to me. It means that when I take that helicopter into the sky, I know that the weapons I'm carrying have been loaded by someone who understands what it means to be part of something real, something that matters. Sarah looked at this young pilot, this young woman pilot, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the crack of pain and isolation that had been her constant companion for 7 years. This was different. This was recognition. This was the kind of respect that couldn't be given. It had to be earned, and she had earned it. For the first time since she'd watched Captain Reeves's helicopter lift off into the Arizona morning, the morning that had started everything, Sarah smiled a real smile. She thought about the girl she'd been 7 years ago, working in Istanbul, believing she could change the world. She thought about the terror of being hunted. She thought about the loneliness of carrying a secret that could never be shared. She thought about all the times she'd wondered if any of it had been worth it. And now she knew. It had been worth it. Every moment of doubt, every instance of disrespect, every night alone in her barracks wondering if anyone would ever truly value her work, it had all been leading to this moment. To a place where she'd earned respect not through explanation or revelation, but through the sheer force of her character and her commitment. Sarah Mitchell, Sergeant First Class, Weapons Specialist, had survived a terrorist's plan to kill her, had survived isolation and doubt, and she'd done it by being exactly who she was, a soldier who did her job with precision and honor, who didn't break under pressure, and who believed that the work mattered. The tattoo on her shoulder blade, the one that had nearly destroyed her, was still there. It would always be there. But it was no longer a mark of shame or danger. It was a reminder of who she was, where she'd come from, what she'd survived. And as she walked out of the hangar that evening, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, she finally felt at home. Not because the danger had passed, not because everyone finally understood, but because she finally understood that her strength had never depended on anyone else's recognition. It had always been there, it had always been real, and now, finally, the world around her was beginning to see it too. The Apache helicopters sat waiting on the flight line, weapons loaded and ready, prepared for missions that would take them into the sky at dawn. And tomorrow, Sarah would be there, doing the job she'd been born to do, knowing that every precision click of every missile launcher was part of something larger than herself. She was a soldier, she was strong, and she had finally found where she belonged,